Decentralize all the things. Decentralize all the things.
Hey there! Welcome to the Web3 Summit Decentralize Now podcast series, hosted by the Decentralize All The Things podcast network. This series features discussions about decentralization from the 2018 Web3 Summit held in Berlin, Germany. This is episode 15. In this episode, we listen in on a great conversation about supporting and funding open source development and why people feel driven to build on open source projects. Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoy the show.
For this next discussion, which is about open source culture and actually supporting open source development. It's a very interesting topic and another one that we don't really have answers for yet. We have some experts though. So yeah, I'll let Scott and I'll let the Gitcoin crew take it away.
Awesome, thanks, Griff. Really, the starting point here, I think, is just to kind of get you guys to think about what open source is, what it means to you guys, and sort of to start, how many of you work on projects that are fundamentally open source, that are currently, so a lot of you, right? That's great. That's a lot more than in the traditional software world. So that's already a good start, right? We're already in a space where most people are kind of familiar with this concept and are actually actively engaging in it. So that's great. I'd actually like to start off, I guess, just by talking a bit about sort of the history of open source. There's actually a great presentation by Andy Tudhope that I want to reference as well, which goes all the way back to the Universal Dictionary and these ideas of what would it be like if we had this complete sort of open source of knowledge that's completely accessible by anyone, usable for any purpose. And so it's an old concept, this idea of having open knowledge and having open collaboration. It's only recently, I think, that we've actually started to really engage with it at a deep level. So the more recent history of open source is Richard Stallman, Linus Torvalds, the early sort of computing days, discussions around licensing. This idea of, okay, so should you have a license that's like GPL? Should it be about ensuring that the commons is protected from people that are just abusing or not giving back to it? Or should it be about ensuring that it's open to anyone, regardless of whether the intent for the use of the software is commercial or not? But to start, just because I'm going to ramble about licenses for a while, I want to get your perspectives first on and maybe we can just go around for this. What is open source to you? What makes something open source? So does anyone want to give their sort of definition first?
Open source, well, for me is, I would say that's everything, especially when you are in crypto. It's I cannot understand any other development if you are in crypto that's not open source. So that's just by default. I think that the big problem in open source is mainly the funding part. I've been for all my life just dreaming that at some point I would be able to make open source project. And I've been just developing closed source for 20 years with a dream in my mind that at some point I would be able to do it open source. Right now, I'm developing open source. I'm personally, I can say that I'm much free, much better. I feel much better in all the circumstances. And what's more interesting is I think that economically it's possible, and you can even make much more money doing open source projects than just working in a closed source project. And the answer is for me at least, is very clear. When you are doing open source project, you are doing projects that you believe on, that you want to build, that you have this. That you know that you are going to change something, that you are going to solve real problems. And this is much more worthy than just doing a closed source for a company that you don't even know where the place is.
Yeah, developing open source is about the ideas and about the problem. When you develop closed source software, it's because you're trying to make a bunch of money and you want to, create artificial scarcity where it doesn't necessarily need to exist. Open source is about abundance and solving problems for the world and creating what I would say is like a common good, a social good, whereas closed source is more selfish and I can't say enough, artificial scarcity.
I was just gonna. I really like that term, artificial scarcity. I hadn't heard that before. I think that's really interesting. The other like dimension that I would add is, I think it's a better development style. Like I think you end up with like better contributors in the whole. You end up with projects that have gone in different directions and have kind of stood the test of an open environment. I think that there are new challenges, and we can get into those as well, about maintaining open source code bases. And LA, who is coming right on time, can probably add some perspectives about the maintainer experience. But in general, I would add that as well, that open source is a great part of the ecosystem. So does anyone else who's working on open source want to give their perspective? Open mic.
It's quite pleasurable working with open source software because, someone has gone through the efforts of building something already. And so your next move is just to combine them together. And you don't get this opportunity with closed source systems. You work in an organization and someone's built something, you want to reuse it. No, it's too hard. Locked up in some system.
So I like the fact that like we're talking about sort of what is open source, and like what some of the answers we're getting are largely about like your own personal experiences and like connection with open source. And I think that speaks to the fact that it is very much a collaborative experience. Like it's something, when you ask someone what is open source, like the first thing that they want to talk about is like, here's why open source is important to me and why I found it to be valuable in like my work. I really like Baki's point in particular, like the idea of combining these different existing constituent components into something that's like, that's not something that's possible with commercial like or closed software. And historically, it's been a huge problem with like how fast we're able to actually develop new systems. I think it's one of the reasons that like this whole ecosystem, like the decentralized web, blockchain, whatever you want to call like Web3, like has grown so quickly, is just because you have access to all of these different components by default. Historically wasn't really an option. Ellie, I haven't given you a chance to give your definition. So do you have a particular sort of like thought on like what is open source to you?
Many things. I think the first thing that comes to my head is just this fascinating human collaboration experiment that is proven to be a success. I think that probably if you had explained this 30 years or 40 years to someone, people would be like, nah, that's bullshit. It'll never happen. Why people would do that? And people do that. So for me, open source is primarily inspiration. There are more things out there, on the collective side. So yeah, inspiration is the key word.
Yeah, just on Ellie's point, at this point, I think the conversation is more about the history of open source, how we've gotten to today. There's a really interesting paper written in around 1990 by Eric Raymond. It's a paper called The Cathedral and the Bazaar. And this kind of talked to the different development approaches of closed source software versus open source software. The Cathedral is the closed source, very structured, hierarchical way to create an open source system, a system. It might work exactly as intentioned, but perhaps for a very specific set of purposes. As opposed to the Bazaar, which is kind of this free-flowing, interesting place that anyone can contribute to, anyone can put their thoughts or ideas towards. And obviously there's fundamental differences and perhaps benefits to cathedrals versus bazaars, but Eric Raven does a really good job of saying, he tells a story of how he watched Linux grow and is just like appalled and and just like kind of doesn't believe that this is possible. And then he does it himself. He builds his own open source project, and he builds it the open source way. He comes up with a set of principles guiding open source, and it's done a lot to drive forward the ecosystem.
I think it's wait, it's actually working. It's around. It's kind of like about accessibility. It's sort of by having a cathedral, your entry barrier is like you have to go up the ranks before you can talk about anything. But with a market or something where there's just much lower entry barrier, people can just get their hands dirty on different things and try it out. And also just observe it, being able to observe something, observe the mechanisms. There's no man behind the curtain. It's just everyone's there working, and you can watch and learn. So it's just this awesome. I sort of want to say garden. I sort of like to answer what is open source. It's almost like a community garden where anyone can get their hands dirty, anyone can help improve a little bit of it, but you can also watch other people improving the garden, and it's just a nice, beautiful thing.
I love this comparison of that, but it's interesting because I think that most of the cathedrals in software has not been done for more than 5-6 persons, and yeah, so that the investment that you need to do a cathedral is just a laptop. So I think these are the keys of the open source, and being able as an individual, as a developer, being able just to think that you can do something better, that you can contribute in something, that you can create something. This is important, incredible. The other thing, and maybe just if you want to go to that say, is like, because building the cathedral is quite easy. The problem is then maintaining the cathedral and giving continuation to the cathedral and all that stuff. And I think here is where we should start talking a little bit more about, because I think this is one of the challenges that we have in the open source community for maintaining and for continue developing, and just to okay, we have a cathedral, but we want this cathedral to be nice, and we want this cathedral to be clean, and we want this cathedral that the people continue going in, and that's how we do that from an open source perspective, maintaining the soul, the sense of the open source.
Building on that, actually, there's a fascinating talk from Nadia Egfald that used to lead open source at GitHub. I think 2 years ago, 3 years ago, she gave that talk at Strange Loop that had the title Rebuilding the Cathedral. And basically, she was going back to Eric Raymond's book, and she was saying that, yes, Eric's story is good, but, it turned out to be that the cathedral actually is quite broken in many ways, simply because we have just a few individuals doing all of the hard work, and then you have, and these are the maintainers, which I think where you were going, and then we have all of these thousands of contributions, and in the end is, not so collaborative. In the end, it's usually like, we think that the open source software is developed always in the open with hundreds of people all the time being very supportive. In the end, it's usually 1-2 individuals late at night suffering while everyone else is like, where is my feature? What's going on? Why that's not available? So I think for the people that really thinking about sustainability of open source, I think please think about the maintainers. These are usually the heroes behind the scenes that no one talks about. So okay, I'm gonna pass it on.
I was just gonna add to that quickly. Yeah, I completely agree with that idea. Maintainers are really fundamentally the lifeblood, and so we talk about this idea of maintainer redundancy, which is kind of funny to talk about in a blockchain context. But basically the point is that you need people that actually understand the code base, that have a really formal sort of not just the time to contribute, but also the energy and ability to contribute in a meaningful way. And you can get lots of contributors that do that, but if they only do it on a one-off basis, it doesn't provide you with a long-term way to maintain or sustain that project. And so you need a way to actually ensure that some of those contributors eventually become maintainers, so that you have this redundancy of people that are really core to the project.
So on the note of maintainers, yes, what is open source? And a lot of people have given some really interesting comments that are kind of arty and beautiful and its inspiration, and it is. And the view that we have through the cathedral windows is wonderful at times. But open source is literally just taking code and putting it with a permissive license. And that's what open source is. And so beyond that, open source is a medium through which current power structures are actually reflected. So open source, a lot of it is actually exploitation. A lot of it is people being asked to do stuff after work. A lot of it is people releasing their code and then getting no remuneration for it, no money back, no prestige. A lot of open source is burnout, which really, really sucks, because we're all huddled by the fire trying to make cool stuff. And some people make it and some people don't. And I say this as someone who loves open source, but for me, open source is how do we fight entropy, and how do we make it a whole lot easier for maintainers to actually stay in the game and be interested, and also love what they do as a result of human plasticity and genius, which is really difficult. So
Sometimes we confuse open source with free. Yeah, so it's like, oh, that's why I have to pay something that's free, right? And I think this, well, just this is an important concept, just to for the maintainers, because I think that's important. I've been 20 years of my life working in a closed source company, and in those companies there is like I always distinguish like two kind of people. Okay, one are the, let's say, the formula ones, the ones that build cathedrals, if you want, you're just building. But then there is another piece on those companies. I call it the DSL people. It's people that the maintainers. Okay, but that's these people that maybe they are not. I would say they are not genius, or they are not considered genius, and maybe they are not. They don't want to be much more problems, but they have they have a discipline, they have a job, they have a continuity, they put the things together. Their life is very, very structured in general, and those persons are absolutely key in maintaining that. So, for me, the question is, and they are doing an incredible job, and they are in those companies. They are, those companies give to those people what they really need. Is this peaceful? A lot of time is you have maybe a salary guaranteed for many times, a schedule, or just a set of people, a set of things that this kind of personality, these persons appreciate a lot. So for me, the question, and I have not the answer, but the question is, those persons that are playing a very important role in those inside the companies, how those persons can be incorporated, can come to the open source projects and receive what they're receiving in those companies, or even more. And that's so. I don't have the answer, but I think that it's very important that those persons in some way come to there. And we go again maybe to the initial question, is how we finance the open source projects. And I think, Scott, this is your turn.
Yeah, I don't want to jump too quickly into the sustainability aspect, which is a huge part of this, which we will definitely get into. But like the ideas of, I really liked your point on free software, actually, like the difference between free software and open source software. There's this distinction that like has been a huge point of contention in the open source community for a long time. Did you want to maybe give like a bit more context on that? Like, it sounds like you're relatively familiar with it. Like it's a really good sort of, I think, historical piece to include here.
Does everyone know what floss is? Okay, so yeah, no.
Yeah, it's so fundamentally this comes back in part to like GPL licensing versus like say MIT licensing. This idea of whether or not an actual commercial entity should be able to get any value out of open source software without contributing back to the ecosystem. Richard Stallman was a big proponent of this idea of. Or does anyone else want to give this explanation? Yeah. Oh,
yeah. So free and libre open source software. So free as not as in beer, but free as in the other thing. Sam, what was it? Free speech. Okay, so yeah. Oh no, I keep brain freezing. I'm sorry. I just wrote a thesis on this, and that was a big mistake.
That's good timing, though. When it does come back to you, it'd be good to have more context on that thesis for sure, actually. But yeah, so it's about freedom versus about being, monetarily free, or about being sort of open in the first place. It's more of like, it's this almost distinction between a pragmatic approach and a ideological approach, both of which are valid in a lot of different ways, but which are very distinct in terms of how you actually execute that. And that's where the licensing part comes in. So you have like GPL licensing, which is much more focused on this idea of, look, this is about this ideology of free, like open community, and like if you're not part of that, then you shouldn't be part of this project. And then alternatively, it's about, well, we just want as many people using this as possible. We want to get it out there, and we want it to be open and like collaborative, regardless of the actual reasons or motivations behind that collaboration. But
so part of that has to do with reuse. So how can you reuse the software? Do you have to reuse it in an open setting? And does everything else that you use and modify on top of it have to be free? Or can you use it in your commercial applications and then sell it? So that's kind of the main distinction between the licensing. There's a lot of different other aspects of licensing that are really important, like waivers of liability, or citation, or whether you should say that every single person who ever helped is part of the contributor. Most people get this wrong, which is really, really funny. Like pretty much all of GitHub is filled with projects that have used GPL projects as their subsidiaries and then just not reference them correctly. And then there's also another aspect besides how you do, whether it's free or not, or whether people are going to be charging for it later. And that aspect is, do I directly pay for the open source software itself? So there's actually new kinds of licenses now. I don't know if any of you know Kyle Mitchell. He has this really cool thing where you can buy a license if you're a company, but if you use it for open source, then you can have it for free, which is really cool. Yeah. So that's kind of fun, and people are working on that. But basically, it's a continuing conversation that's been going back for around 40 years, which is why it's hard to figure out, like, what does it actually mean? And that's all part of open source, but the majority of people today who enter the market and are starting to write code just think of open source as, it's on GitHub, it has an MIT license, and I can use it. And so when you get into topics of like what is free and what is Libra, that's when you kind of should go read a lot of books and then come back.
Well, yeah, it is. It's the what is freedom kind of thing. But I just on that thought, a lot of the Libre free stuff seems to come from, actually, even the closed stuff. A lot of open source philosophy seems to come from commons philosophy and the idea of gifting. Many of these events, there's even gifting ceremonies where it's paid for by the company and people just go, "Oh, thank you for showing me around," and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, I enjoy that side of things. That's all I wanted to say on the subject. But it's good when we're thinking about open source to think about commons as well, because commons has been around a lot longer than open source, so we can learn a lot from that even before computers were applied to it. But then again, that's a lot more than 40 years worth of research, isn't it? Like, yeah, so like I wouldn't be particularly knowledgeable on anything, but back in the day we would gift each other items. Before we had financial instruments and gold and silvers and all that, we'd pass around shells in like odd islands. I don't even know what they're called, but we gift each other as a way of signifying social status. So those that accumulated wealth was actually just other people going, "Thank you," you know. So that's what give us about, isn't it? So probably the appropriate place. Then I guess from that kind of side of things, we had a lot of commons areas, which would be like you've probably all heard the green field and the cows grazing, and you overgraze it and you have the rent dissipation of the green field and nobody can then keep their cows on it. That's one very narrow frame to look at it through. There's many more. There's fisheries that people have solved and not solved these problems many times over in the past. And why they work or don't work is down to a lot of conditions. Or usually in a commons you have appropriators and provisioners, from a game theoretic kind of thing. It's two layers, and from the provisioning side, it's those that take from the commons and you appropriate the fish to, you know, sell for whatever. And then you have maintainers of the code, the provisioners, and they would provide the commons with a sustainable way of going about what they're doing. So the appropriators can still take the fish because the provisioners are making sure that they don't overfish the fish. But it's an iterative loop.
So one framework that was very helpful on my understanding of the commons was this work that Elinor Ostrom did. Yeah, cool. So she wrote this book 1990 called Governing the Commons, and basically what she did is she said that the world understands public and private goods, but actually not everything is classified as public or private. We also have these things that we call commons, and she used this very simple framework that talked about excludability and subtractability, and this two-dimensional framework, basically, where she said that we have things that are impossible to exclude people from, and when people consume them, they don't subtract from the rest. And these are public goods. Think, for example, the air we're breathing. You cannot exclude people from that. And you also, when you consume more air from me, it's okay. There's no biggie. But we also have things where basically it's impossible to exclude people from, but when they overconsume, you subtract from the rest. And this is the case. So, for example, this is the case with I don't know, let's say. Exactly, like that. That's exactly right. So these are what she coined as common pool resources, which many times we're referring as the commons, and then the rest are private goods and public goods. So that's just one conceptual framework that she used, and then she went further from that and said, okay, what's the most optimal way for us to govern the commons? And she looked at markets, she looked at governments, and she looked at communities, and she found out that actually there's not one size fits all. In many cases, for example, like managing fisheries, many times the communities were actually the best to manage that because they had local knowledge and a bunch of other things that were happening down there. But she basically challenged this idea, Hardin's work on the tragedy of the commons, and said that it doesn't have to be that. There are actually many times better ways to manage the commons rather than the government or the market, potentially sometimes the community, but not one size fits all solution. So that's one. Yes.
Amongst those three categories, governments, communities, markets, were there any guidelines? Were there any? So you mentioned social context and specific knowledge for why communities might make sense. In what cases, government or market?
So she came up with actually 7 rules, I think, if I remember correctly. And there's a book of that that's called Rule for Radicals. And I don't remember all of them. Don't put me on the spot. But I remember that, for example, she was saying that, for example, self-policing and self-monitoring is very important. And one of the actually interesting use cases of the blockchain is that now, for the first time ever, we can use economic incentives to engineer a situation where we self-monitor who's using, right? And that was part of my talk, like downstairs before, which is, in open source we have the dependency graph. The problem is that you can game that, but what if you couldn't? What if we could use economic incentives to keep that dependency graph somehow clean? So that's one rule that's had this idea of communities need to be able to self-monitor. She also had the second rule, which was communities should have a way to enumerate, I think, which you mentioned about enumeration. And then, Alex, do you remember any others of your stuff? One other thing that I kept from her research was the idea of local knowledge, and she was saying that basically she was studying communities that were managing commons, for example, like forests. And she said that she had this one use case from Nepal where basically when foreigners went down to Nepal and they looked at the engineering that they were using to maintain their forests, they were laughing. And then she was like, they saw the engineering that they were using and they were like, oh, this is irrelevant. Like, we can do this much better. And then basically they brought like the state-of-the-art technology to try to manage the Nepalese forests, and they failed big time simply because they were lacking local knowledge. So that was another very interesting consideration that she had, is that always respect local knowledge. Oh, you have it? Okay.
Yeah. Come on, yeah, you should, yeah. Please. All right, this is awesome. Not expected. This is good. I'm glad we're getting into this. She won a Nobel Prize for this, no?
Yeah. 2009 it says.
Cool.
Clearly defined boundaries. Well, I should say that's 1. There's 7 with an 8th rule here. So 1 is clearly defined boundaries. Individuals or households who have rights to withdraw resource units from the CPR must be clearly defined, as must be boundaries of the CPR itself. 2. Congruence between appropriation and provision rules and local conditions. Appropriation rules restricting time, place, technology, and or quantity of resource units are related to local conditions and to provision rules requiring labor, material, and or money, i.e. that they're linked together in a loop. Collective choice arrangements. Most individuals affected by the operational rules can participate in modifying the operational rules. Monitors who actively audit CPR conditions and appropriator behavior are accountable to the appropriators or are the appropriators. Ground up. Graduated sanctions. Appropriators who violate operational rules are likely to be assessed graduated sanctions, depending on the seriousness of the context of the offence, by other appropriators, by officials accountable to these appropriators, or both. So you break the rules, you get scolded.
Yeah. So I was saying that this particular point on graduated sanctions, I think it's very relevant for blockchains as well, where, you know, as in many forms of governance, we start introducing punishments, but we actually I don't know if we have seen any implementation of graduated sanctions as Ostrom is using them.
Yes, all the proof of stake mainly they are about sanctions. So that's it's graduated. It's but you know, it's work in progress again. But yeah, that's that idea, and it's very powerful on that.
But don't forget that blockchains, while one part of the community, aren't the only part of this community. So all the GitHub stuff, if you have a code of conduct, that's graduated sanctions at a time. If you decide that, hey, if you do this one more time, then you're going to get kicked out. So that's also just as important to blockchain maintenance, is figuring out how you're going to deal with actual users coding as well.
Cool. I'll just give you the last two and get out of here. Conflict resolution mechanisms. Appropriators and their officials have rapid access to low-cost air arenas to resolve conflicts amongst appropriators or between appropriators and officials, i.e. court system. Minimal recognition of rights to organize. The rights to appropriators to devise their own institutions are not challenged by external governmental authorities, i.e. you can form social coding and other little groups and they can all kind of intermingle, I think. Yes, as you just do it. You don't have to ask permission. So yeah, that's the 7 of them anyway.
I just want to look at the 7 one more time, maybe. So the first part was the clearly defined boundaries, which was individuals or households who have the rights to withdraw resource units must be clearly defined. So trying to bring this back to the open source context, right? Like in not particular forms of licensees, you don't limit that. So I'm trying to think about in the open source context.
Like open source code, as all IP doesn't have competitive consumption, right? Okay. And this, I think, is a rule that is more like for commons with competitive consumption.
Okay. Just quickly on that point, what we're talking about, like different licensing models and so forth. I mean, when we're thinking about open source software as IP, like one concept I wanted to bring up quickly is just the Harbinger, I believe, tax model. I don't know if it's a soft or hard G there, but effectively the concept is that you set some kind of, you self-assess the value of some property and pay taxes at that value with the expectation that you should be willing to pay that price for the actual good or service that your property that you're retaining or getting access to. So I think that's a really interesting potential model, or like separate license, and solves some of what's potentially discussed here.
Awesome. Sorry to go back to the previous point. Clearly defined boundaries. We do have that in open source. We do have it in blockchains because you have a finite amount of attention for maintainers. And so I can't ping a maintainer by calling their cell phone and saying, can you fix this bug? Because they're going to say, screw you. I'm sleeping right now, right? And so instead you have to go through clearly defined boundaries, such as open an issue on GitHub or go to my Gitter channel or my Riot channel. And we have to define those collaboratively as a community for what's okay for using the maintainer's bandwidth. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think I misinterpreted it. Now so the resource unit in this case is really the maintainer's time, like scarcity of his time, his or her time. Cool. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we could probably spend a lot of time just like looking at these. I mean, and it could be a good use of time too, but yeah.
Yeah, kind of part of the reason that I wanted to jump to that topic was because we're just at about the whole Harbinger tax thing is we're at noon now. And so I wanted to kind of try to shift the discussion a bit so that we have enough time to go over it, because I imagine it'll be like pretty popular in terms of how much there's a lot to discuss around sustaining open source software. So I'd like to maybe start by getting people's sort of thoughts on best ways to do that. I mean, for us, obviously, we're looking at bounty models for sustaining open source software. That's one approach. Ellie just had a great talk on this and like different approaches that currently are being pursued. And I think that I'd love to get everyone's perspective on sort of what their view is on the best way to sustain open source, or ways that they're seeing implemented currently or that could be implemented that they think are particularly interesting.
I think the best way to maintain open source is probably to actually monetize services on top of the product, and then to ask for donations and or a contracting model, which is why I set up a company that helps people do that. So I run Maintainer Mountaineer that just explicitly like helps people grow their user bases so that they can then monetize on top of it. That's my answer.
So when you talk about monetizing on top of it, like, does that include providing like some kind of additional proprietary service, or like just support, or like, so this was something that Ellie talked about in his talks as well. There's a lot of options around monetizing on top of a code base. What in your opinion have been like the most successful ways that you've seen projects do that? And if you have any examples, that'd be really cool too.
Yeah, so the most successful ways are probably going to be actually donation models at this point for the really charismatic leaders. So people like Feros and Drasorhas that set up Patreons that then get a lot of money, or Open Collective. Open Collective works well when you don't have a charismatic leader, but you have a small group of maintainers who actually provide a product that's used by a lot of people. So, for instance, Knock currently gets like $1,000 a month or something for its use. Or there's a Babel. Babel got a lot of money, and now people are able to actually work full time on it because of Open Collective. Open Collective is a website that's basically allowing people to pool PayPal transactions at the end of the day, which is actually pretty cool. So those work really well. Besides that, there's premium models. Read the Docs uses a premium model where you can pay to have better service, or you can pay to have support, period. And then everything else is kind of, we'll support it as we can, but it's open source, so this is all volunteer run, so we don't really mind if we don't get to you in a month. But if you want us to get to you now, well, then give us some money, which I think is a totally legitimate way of saying capitalism works and we would like to use it. Gitcoin is a good example of another model, but you could talk about that better than I could.
Yeah, I don't want to talk too much about that because, like, I feel like that's kind of pitching. But, like, effectively the way it works, I guess, is just that you have a GitHub issue and you can put any sort of ERC20 token towards that as a form of bounty. But ultimately, we see this as one sort of piece of a larger puzzle of sustaining open source. Jordy, I'd be curious to get your thoughts because I know that was a topic that you wanted to talk about earlier, and we're finally at that point.
Here, I think it's here we have like for this we have like two different problems, and I think it's good to split them. One is the accountability. Now, for all these maintainers, what's the quality of these maintainers? How much work? What's the real work? So how we make an accountable of that? And the other is the funding by itself, where the money comes from. Okay, so I think that if we try to solve these problems in a split way, in a divide and conquer method, I think we're going to get to do it better. Okay, for the way of accountability, here we can start thinking about quality. Now, quality strategies, things of testing, things of reputation, think of users, that the people that's using this open source ways of signaling feedback, how we can get this information and how can we make some metrics, some measures that can help in knowing how is good, how is bad. And from the funding part, then this is like a different topic for me. It's like here we can start from I think you mentioned here the options: freemium, just collective donations. Here there are different ways. Again, I do not have all the answers, but I think that it should not be difficult to have a system where an open source project that's really creating value to the society should not have problems of funding. So I think this is possible. Maybe it's using the capitalism system, maybe it's using other systems, but I think this is possible. But we need to measure this value that we are adding. So it's not if we are not able to measure the value, it's going to be very difficult to claim it.
Yes, so I think there's that idea we'd all subscribe to, is to yes, a good project should be able to sustain itself, or should have the money to then sustain it. But I was just thinking before of the other side of the equation is that developer hours are the constrained resource, and based on the individual, if they're sort of more idealistic and more like prioritizing small piecemeal projects and putting aside their stability in some sense, that if they're hopping from one thing to the next until they land a full-time open source gig, which might be quite hard, a lot of those resources are going to get locked into full-time work with traditional companies probably building closed source things. So I just look at that as the other challenge. Like, one thing would be to have the money, absolutely, to be able to provide the same stability, and that would be maybe one way to get them out of that. But I'm not sure what else can disrupt that model around getting people out. Like, I don't know, thawing these people who are trapped inside full-time work to contribute to the good things in a stable way.
So that's a really good point. And funding a single person working on a single project is a whole different ballgame than, say, funding something like Node, right? So how do you do that? And so there's different models that are working right now. So some of them are foundational models where you set up a voting structure where large sponsors can then donate thousands of dollars towards the development of a community, which then actually works by, I don't want to use the word exploiting in a bad way, but by having a lot of maintainers come and use their free time to do it without properly getting paid for that, but instead it's just offloaded to the entire community. Another way to think about it, if you're pitching it to your manager, if you're pitching it up higher in the company, right, is open source is a loss leader for your company. So what it is that you're actually losing developer hours, but what you're gaining is developer incentives. So people want to stay on the project and they want to stay at your company because they've been given half their time to work in open source. Or alternatively, you can say, we're such a great company, we do open source, right? Microsoft has clued onto this in a big way recently, where they're like, hey, if we just do open source stuff, everyone will like us again. And it seems to be working, right? Like, it's everyone loves Microsoft now. And so if you do that, actually from an advertising model and from the idea that you can then hire top talent, and even more, you can hire top talent who've already been part of your community, who already know your code base. You don't have to onboard people who have been donating their time. It's almost like a no-brainer from a managerial perspective if you're a large company. If you're a small person or you're a mid-level, it's a lot more difficult. And this sort of comes back to all important projects should be maintained, but should comes with it expectations. And where those expectations come from and where they end is kind of the ambiguous hard bit. So
I'm very new to this open source space. I've been indoctrinated by Boki Puba to put all my things open, so it's been a really interesting 9 months. I come from the big data space, and so in the machine learning, so we have like 3 big players, Cloudera, Hortonworks, and so they do open source for Apache Hadoop and Spark and all these projects. And so in their space, you have these multi-billion-dollar companies who are maintaining effectively a shared code base, but they have this like multi-billion-dollar incentive to develop this product. I'm just curious what your thoughts about like a project like Hadoop and Spark and how that would relate to some of the projects that we are trying to build.
Well, just I think responsibility. I think, and this is very important. And I don't know how to do it but when you are using an open source project, you should be aware that you are using an open source project, and you just contribute. I think so. For me, at least, I like the donation model in that sense, because at the end it's the best model if it happens. But I think it's for me it's the awareness. So I am sure right now I feel that there are a lot of open source projects that are doing an incredible work, and the people is using those open source processes and they don't even have the awareness of the work or even the people that's behind there or that what's implied. So for me, at least, having a system so if a company, if a company, a for-profit company is using an open source software for free, that's great. It's open source. They can use it. But I would love that they at least have awareness. Okay, you are using an open source project, and what you really, at least you will contribute on that would be that. Of course, it's open source. You can do whatever you want. But at least having this awareness, having this number, having this accountability, this accounting system, I think this is important. Or at least this is the first step. How much we have to charge on that.
Just quickly on that, I just want to add that, like, yeah, awareness is super important. I think that the quintessential example of that, which I always bring up and many people bring up, is OpenSSL, right? Which really everyone uses. Like, it's probably one of the most popular open source projects, and really no one actually thought about it until Heartbleed happened, and then suddenly everyone cared about it quite a bit because it had caused billions of dollars of losses. And so in those cases, I'm not sure how you manage that without a donation model or some kind of incentive for open source in particular. Like, I like the idea of having, especially, and Nadia makes this distinction going back to her sort of work, between open source applications and open source infrastructure. I think the sort of model that you're describing with having services on top of a business or on top of an open source project make a lot of sense in the context of applications, but in the infrastructure layer, like OpenSSL, I can't imagine there being like a model that would work for them where they would offer like an enterprise service, because it's just such a critical piece of infrastructure.
Yeah, so in that case, it would be more like using the developer's time for other things and saying, I can only work part-time in this, in which case it's up to the maintainer to say, here's my expectations for how much work I have, which is really hard because humans are really bad at setting boundaries with other humans. Going back to your statement that people should be aware, there's a couple of projects that are working on that. So like libraries.io has a huge dependency graph. Back Your Stack, I think, might use that dependency graph, which is like another project, I think, by Open Collective right now to figure out what your stack is and like what you're actually using. It doesn't help with things like Heartbleed, which is like in Chrome, but then, you know, there's things like Mozilla. And so people are getting more aware over time, and we're getting there, and we have projects to make that happen. Yeah.
I don't know if it's possible, and that's just an ongoing thought. But for example, I'm going back a little bit to the licenses. So can exist an open source licenses where you're just forcing to the users of this open source that at least they give awareness. So they know. So you have to to publish that I'm using that. So that's the only obligation you have. But you have to tell us that you are using that and you are making that you're whatever, your field, that form or something like that. Just, of course, it's the same model, open source, whatever, but you are using that, so you have the obligation to just account that you are using that. If we have I think this is a good.
But well, attribution being the word, but surely they have that in their metrics, so it's up to the software provider providing the software to create the attribution metrics to find out where their users came from and where they downloaded, who's got what, and how many of them. But it seems like a pretty standard thing in most code, but I'm not sure about open source, I got to admit.
I don't want to put Ellie on the spot here, but I'm very curious. I mean, we've been talking a lot about sustainability. You just had a really good talk about it. If you want to maybe spend a few minutes and explain it.
Yeah, so in short, we're going full crazy, but in a longer format. So where we started was with this idea that indeed, we have applications and libraries, and I also come from the big data world. To answer your question, for something like Hadoop and all of these things, you can charge around it, right? Like for libraries, it actually doesn't work that well, and libraries are the backbone of the internet. So, you basically, what would you say? That I'm going to put one function, behind the paywall, and then the rest will be free. So that model doesn't work there. So where we started is actually, and what we do with OSCoin is we saw in cryptocurrencies a different way to finance open source. And we got very excited with Bitcoin because we saw in Bitcoin a way to reward value producers within a network. And of course, you have to enumerate them to do that, right? Which is what proof of work is. But we started from that. And then at some point in 2016, we started seeing other currencies like Dash or Zcash, where they took the same idea and they said, you know what? We're minting a few new tokens and we're distributing them to our value producers. Okay. On Bitcoin, these value producers were only the miners. Okay. Now, but Zcash said that we are also value producers. Human work. There's human work in decentralized networks. So what they came up with is they came up with what they call founders reward. And at every block, they mint a few new tokens. And then a few of these new tokens go to the Zcash Foundation, which is a centralized body that then further deploys that capital towards their community. Das took the same idea, but now they had the same idea, but in a decentralized fashion, and they use coin voting. And I spoke about that on my talk. It's fascinating. It's very problematic from a game theoretic point of view that you with my tokens I like support your city library, you support my city library, and then we both make money somehow, and we cheat the system, right? So that's a tragedy of the commons again. But we started seeing people experimenting with this thing. So where we ended up with this thought process was that what if we actually try to create a network for developers to come in and collaborate around code that now has also economic primitives around that. You can think of it as a peer-to-peer alternative to GitHub and GitLab, right? And I know that it sounds crazy, but we're pursuing this. And now in our thinking, there's a currency behind that you can use to transact within that network. And then this currency is, again, we're minting it at every block, and some of these new tokens go towards the validators, miners that provide the infrastructure, and a small portion of these tokens go back to the community towards the open source projects, right? So you can think of it as an open source tax. Okay, what if we had a cryptocurrency that some of the newly minted tokens were going all towards open source, right? So that's where we started. And then now the question remains on how do you actually go and allocate. Let's say you had I don't know what Bitcoin does these days, but it's on the millions again, rewards, right? What if, let's say we had $1 million a month, okay? Let's make it very simple to give to open source. Still, there's the question, how do you do that, right? How do you enumerate? Where do you give that? So we started looking at different things like, coin voting type of stuff, but they're very problematic. And then where we ended up with, and that's the direction that we're exploring right now, is we end up back to dependencies. So we were like, what actually if we try to create a canonical way for you to specify your dependencies, and then we're using this dependency graph and we're using something similar to PageRank to actually go and, if we had 1 million, to basically distribute that to different open source projects based on their PageRank. And that's the vision we're pursuing. And in that vision, there are two pieces of work. There's one which we call Radical, and it's a peer-to-peer network for code collaboration, and it has some nice properties that we can talk about, but not so interesting. And then on the other side has a currency that you can use now to transact within that network, and a small portion of that currency at every block goes back to open source using something like PageRank that Alexei called it, which my co-founder calls it SourceRank for now. That's the idea. It's a wild idea. It's a wild project. It's just a very different take on financing open source. Yeah. OS coin. Yeah.
In general, I really like that idea of finding ways to fund down a dependency graph because of how important it is to actually, this ability to understand what you're using. The awareness component is very challenging. And I think that if you just have people get funding through a dependency graph, or for that to be part of this system, it kind of alleviates or makes it easier to get those people funding without people necessarily knowing every dependency that they're using. So I think that what you're doing on that front is really cool. The other one I'll give a shout out to is Dandelion with SourceCred. Again, libraries.io is fantastic and is the backbone for a lot of these projects. And the fact that we have that data is great, and we really should be making use of it. So I'm glad that we're starting to see that.
So we have 3 minutes left. I kind of want to go back through a lot of the resources and things that we've talked about, and just for everyone who's interested, could you remind me the name of the book that you... Elinor Ostrom's Governing the Commons. That was a book that was referenced. We talked about the cathedral and the bazaar. Nadia's work, which is the lemonade stand, and the talk was Rebuilding the Cathedral. Yep, a really good blog by Nadia.
Also, if anyone's interested, tomorrow in London there's Sustain, which is a conference that happens once a year for sustaining open source. I'm going to be there. You guys all going to be there?
We'll have some people there. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So that happens. We had it last year in San Francisco. Now we're having it in London. We had a pop-up last year in London. We're also open source in our management. So if you want to help out, jump on. It'd be super sweet. But yeah, that's a really cool conference. So to watch what comes out of it is fun if you can't be there. Yeah. Every year, so we take up all the notes and write them up, and then try to make a nice PDF. So sustainoss.org.
Yep.
Just to finish, I'm a wallflower in this space. I'd love to contribute, but I've never been able to actually, take the leap. And just one of the questions that I have for you guys is how do you incentivize other people to, you obviously have 2 or 3 champions in a project or a maintainers, how do you incentivize or make it accessible for someone to put a line or put a...
So we're thinking a lot about that at Gitcoin. We're doing bounties on different projects, specifically by the GitHub issue, anything specific that you can build out, whether it be a feature or helping with a bug or doing something new on a project. So that's a subset that we can talk more about if you want. Cheers.
Awesome. Yeah. One closing thought.
One ask is because I think it has been amazing. Right now, my mind is blown because I think a lot of resources and a lot of things has happened. If we can write just a gist with the links, just the links of everything that happens here, yeah, or whatever, just something, a tweet, just with the links that just because I think that it's like this conversation that takes some time to mature.
Griff can send that out to everybody, and I'll make sure that Griff gets it. But I'm VCing do things. So anyways, we can, but we can. I'll get it from Griff, and we can get it figured out. It's a lot harder to spell. The lemonade, Nadia Egbal. Yeah, and if anyone else has other resources that they'd like to recommend while we're here,
Yeah, there's a lot of older work as well that's still super relevant from the Richard Stallman days. Obviously, his writing is really influential, and you might sit on one side or the other of his arguments, but he's a really good person to get perspective from. And I think that other than that, we'll compile a large list. Actually, it's a good idea, and we'll share that with everyone. And I think that's a good starting point to continue this conversation. But thanks, guys, for being part of this, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks for listening. If you haven't already, please subscribe and give us a rating or comment if you enjoyed this content. This episode was brought to you by Santa and the unicorns at giveth.io. Remember, this podcast is made possible by the donations we receive from listeners like you. If you'd like to help support the podcast, you can do so by donating Ether at datpodcast.com. That's DATT podcast.com. Please check the show notes for more information. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep decentralizing all the things.